I think it's important always to go back and start from the roots of the conflict. Um, Colombia is a very complex country with a history of violence. After the independence in 1810, when the political parties started basically to fight between them, the people of Colombia were fighting against each other because of the political factions, liberals and conservatives, yeah, and originated in various criminal groups at the beginning called guerrillas. The political parties were basically gaining control only in the middle of the capital cities. The rest of the country was isolated. The presence of the state never took to any of the regions in Colombia, and the people from other little cities and towns were basically left behind. And the government never in the history took responsibility in the rural areas. The guerrillas were born with an ideal to change the rural areas, to have access to financial support, to have access to education, to have access to health. So the guerrilla was born with the ideal of changing Colombia. Now, since the late 70s and the beginning of the 80s, we have a new actor in this scenario, in this conflict: narcotraffic. Narcotraffic was and is and remains one of the biggest issues in Colombia. We are the biggest exporter of cocaine in the world. By the time in the 80s, we were the bigger exporter of marijuana or cannabis of the world. And when they realized the importance and the magnitude of narco-traffic, I mean the guerrillas, and because the narco dealers were growing cocaine in the mountains where the guerrillas had the power, they start to deal with them, and so they basically started to first take care of of all the land where they were cultivating marijuana and cocaine. Then they started to deal with, when they realized how big was financially this business, they changed the whole perspective of their ideology, and they became narco dealers. So, by that time, basically from the early 80s, the guerrilla started to deal with drugs. Therefore, they started also to kidnap people. They started to put bombs in the big cities. The most important negotiation period was with former President Andrés Pastrana in the 90s, late 90s, when they basically opened a huge space of land in Colombia to negotiate. They gave that place to the guerrillas to basically gather together and start a process of peace. That process failed. The guerrillas took more power even, and the narcomany, if you want to call it that way, basically made them stronger. They don't want to go to jail. This is basically what they have on the table. Guerrillas don't want to go to jail. Nor the head of the guerrillas is prepared to go to jail. So they are trying to put in the table a process where they can pay somehow to the Colombian community the violations to human rights that they committed during years. And this is where the discussion is at this point happening. Now they are trying to see and to ask the Colombian community to accept the fact that they are going to pay to some extent the crimes that they committed, but not in form of a jail, in a jail period of time, if you like. What they're facing now, it's the polarization in Colombia. So you have one faction that, of course, they are fighting for the peace process. They are really trying to push for a signature of peace. But you have, on the other hand, the opposition who doesn't want that to happen. And one of the arguments for that is that these people is not going to face jail, of course. Of course. Now, you have the international community now, human rights, of course, Human Rights Watch, the CPI, and all the international organizations looking into that process. This process is being developed within the frame of the international justice. So what they are trying to incorporate in the table of negotiations is the idea of paying back to the society, not in jail, with social work, with social inclusion, with putting them to work towards the development of the society, either in politics, either in education, either with being part of this is just ideas that they're putting on the table, be part of the army, be part of the police force, helping the regional areas to develop the agricultural projects. However, the victims at this stage agree with the process. They are happy. The families of the victims and the survivors of years of conflict. But now the focus is on educating the population. How are you going to educate Colombians to agree upon the fact that they are not going to probably get into jail? How are you going to deal with the fact that those who kidnapped thousands of people are going to get away with murder, if you like? How the community is going to deal with the idea of having to vote for those people who for years diminished the population, diminished the possibility of development in regional areas in Colombia? And how are you going to deal with people who for years have basically took over the country? When I say over the country, in Colombia you weren't able to travel by car from one city to another because the guerrillas were spread all around Colombia, and you couldn't even travel for tourism, for whatever you like, or even because it was more likely that you were going to be kidnapped. The paramilitary faction was fighting the guerrillas, but they got into a point where, of course, they became narco dealers as well. That government of Álvaro Uribe took them into the table, but some of them are now the big heads of criminal groups in Colombia. So the fear is as well that now the guerrillas, or the factions of the guerrillas who don't want to sit on the table and sign this agreement, could end up as criminal bands as well. And so there's the complexity and the layers of the conflict are so deep and difficult to comprehend that probably one of the big issues now for the society is to understand the conflict.
An ex-guerrilla member integrating them into the defence force or education instead of a jail sentence as a way of giving back to the community. How do you conceive that? How would a Colombian conceive that?
With that hope, if you like, of changing things, the international community is trying to push for an education program from a different approach, if you like, to pay back to Colombians. And of course, it's going to take years. It's not a change that is going to happen as soon as they sign the paper. How the government is going to finance the post-conflict. And now they are trying to go out and they're asking the international community to get involved in that process.
So what do you mean by finance the post-conflict?
Of course, if you are going to start a series of programs to incorporate the 8,000 guerrilla members into society.
Only the ones from the FARC?
Only the ones from the FARC at the moment. You have 8,000 guerrilla members from the FARC who are going to become now citizens again of Colombia, that you have to provide them with education again, and they are going to be involved in all of those programs that they're willing to run. Now you have 6 million people who don't have their lands. Their lands were stolen. They are not farmers anymore. They are living in the big cities. Now you need to give them back their lands. Mm-hmm. For that you need a huge amount of money. The government needs to start giving all the families and the farmers little spaces of land to start again their lives out of the big cities. So money, of course, they are looking for money all around the world. Actually, the international community is trying to get involved in that. Europe, in a way, at the moment is willing to give a bit of money. The United States as well is going to be a main actor in this new development. But if you're going to think about a post-conflict, you need to talk about dollars.
Is the peace process palatable for the Colombian people, and do you see it succeeding in the long term?
There's a lot of people who are against the peace process. We can say there's a majority who are not willing to be this happening. However, the numbers are big. The opposition lately is campaigning heavily against the process, for the reasons I just gave, because they do not agree with the leaders not paying jail terms. They don't agree with the things that have been actually agreed until the moment about the agricultural reform and and some other issues and the justice model that they are willing to implement. But there's always at the other side of the coin, if you like. The opposition is run by Álvaro Uribe. During Álvaro Uribe's presidency, the paramilitary factions were armed and formed. Basically, all the structure of the state, not all, but most of the structure of the state was built under the base of the paramilitarism, and proof of that is that most of the people who were close to Álvaro Uribe are in jail now. But Álvaro Uribe remains free and campaigning against that new process.
But you would think why all these people went to jail and the FARC, the guerrillas, will not go to jail, like a double standard.
Yes and no, because the paramilitary factions were in government, in power. The guerrillas are not in power right now.
Okay.
They were fighting against the paramilitary faction and the government and dealing with narcotics, but they weren't in power. The paramilitary faction was in power in Colombia during the last years. The criminal bands are now operating in different parts of Colombia, and they are acting as the paramilitary faction were when they were in those areas. They are big, they are dealing again with weapons, and they are dealing with narcotics. And that's the very right wing in Colombia. All what they are doing now is, apart from trying to keep their regions, if you like, in control, is basically dealing with drugs. The state level at the moment is still corrupted by the paramilitary faction. There are still processes in course for many members of parliament who were involved in paramilitarism, and the process continues, and they are discovering that the remains of that Uribe Vélez era remains in power, if you like. And if you want to still remain with the head, at this moment Álvaro Uribe is senator in Colombia. That has stopped, of course, all the investigations. Because it's important to take into account that it's not only the guerrillas. The Colombian government systematically violated human rights as well. And part of this process is actually bringing into justice the military faction in Colombia, the military power, if you like, and the government, who for years also undermined the rights of people in Colombia. Basically, what is happening now is a commitment from both parties involved, government and guerrillas, to go to the final consequences to sign a peace process by the end of March, as they tried to explain to the public a few weeks ago. There's, however, no peace yet in Colombia. There's no as a written commitment to stop attacks or to stop bombing or to stop attacking each other. There's not a written agreement yet on that. The guerrillas say, we, from our part, we're going to stop kidnapping and we're going to stop the attacks towards the civilian community. But there's just a verbal, oral commitment. There's no peace yet. And the peace doesn't stop with a signature of an agreement between the FARC and the government. There are still the remains of the paramilitary factions, the criminal bands, there's still the ELN, and violence in Colombia is huge, it's across cities. The violence in the big cities, it's a big problem from the local governments. This is just another step. This is a very important step, of course, to sign a peace agreement, but this is not the end of the violence, and this is not peace in terms of we're going to still have to deal with the other parties involved, of criminal parties in Colombia, and narco traffic, of course, is part of it.